June 28, 1776. Sullivan's Island, South Carolina. The fort wasn't finished. Everyone knew it. Colonel William Moultrie stood on a rampart made of two parallel walls of palmetto logs, packed between them with loose sand, and watched 9 Royal Navy warships drop anchor less than half a mile offshore. The rear wall of his fort didn't exist yet, just open sky where a wall should have been. He had 400 and some men, 31 cannon, and enough gunpowder for a battle that everyone in Charleston expected to be a massacre. The largest amphibious force the British Empire had yet assembled in North America was about to open fire on a sandbar held together by tree bark and hope. June 28, 1776. Sullivan's Island, South Carolina. The fort wasn't finished. Everyone knew it. Colonel William Moultrie stood on a rampart made of 2 parallel walls of palmetto logs, packed between them with loose sand, and watched 9 Royal Navy warships drop anchor less than half a mile offshore. The rear wall of his fort didn't exist yet, just open sky where a wall should have been. He had 400 and some men, 31 cannon, and enough gunpowder for a battle that everyone in Charleston expected to be a massacre. The largest amphibious force the British Empire had yet assembled in North America was about to open fire on a sandbar held together by tree bark and hope. Nobody in that fort was supposed to win this. Not the men inside it, not the general watching from the mainland, and certainly not the British admiral who'd spent weeks planning exactly how to erase it. So how did a half-built pile of sand and swamp would stop a Royal Navy fleet cold, and end up changing the entire trajectory of the war for American independence? By the spring of 1776, the American rebellion was still technically a rebellion, not yet a declared independent nation, just 13 colonies in open revolt with an army that barely deserved the name. Boston had been evacuated by the British in March. Congress in Philadelphia hadn't yet voted on independence. And in London, the strategic thinking was simple. The northern colonies were a hornet's nest, but the South was supposed to be different. Royal governors believed the Carolinas and Georgia were full of loyalists just waiting for a British army to show up and give them cover to rise. Crush Charleston, the thinking went, and the South falls into line without much of a fight. William Moultrie was 45 years old that June, a South Carolina planter and former Indian trader who'd spent more of his life on horseback and behind a musket than behind a desk. He wasn't a career soldier. He'd been a militia officer, a colonial assemblyman, a man who understood the Carolina Lowcountry, its tides, its heat, its sand, better than any British engineer ever would. That mattered more than anyone realized at the time. Moultrie had grown up watching the Lowcountry's climate defeat outsiders who didn't respect it. He knew palmetto with the way a shipwright knows oak, knew that the trunks of the sabal palmetto didn't splinter the way pine or oak did when struck. They were fibrous, spongy, almost rubbery inside. He'd seen it firsthand. And when Charleston's Defense Committee ordered a fort built on Sullivan's Island to guard the harbor entrance, Moultrie built it out of exactly that wood, because it was cheap, it was local, and, though nobody could prove it yet, he suspected it might actually work. His superior did not share his confidence. Major General Charles Lee arrived in Charleston in early June to take overall command of the Southern Department, and he took one look at Fort Sullivan and considered it a death trap. Lee was a brilliant, erratic, foul-tempered professional soldier, a former British officer, a mercenary who'd fought in Europe, a man with a genuine tactical mind and almost no patience for amateur defenses. He looked at the unfinished rear wall, the exposed garrison, the total absence of any retreat route off the island, and he concluded that Moultrie's fort would be a coffin the moment the British Navy opened fire on it. Lee wanted it abandoned. He said so, repeatedly, to anyone who'd listened. Moultrie, the South Carolina Council of Safety, President of South Carolina John Rutledge. He argued the garrison should pull back to the mainland before the British fleet arrived and turned the whole island into a killing ground with no way out. Rutledge overruled him, flatly. He sent Moultrie a message that has survived almost word for word. He would rather Moultrie's men be cut to pieces than abandon the post without a fight. That decision, a civilian politician overruling a professional general, is the hinge this entire battle turns on. Because if Lee had gotten his way, there would have been no fort, no battle, and quite possibly no Charleston left standing by autumn. Picture the scene on the morning of June 28th, because the geography here decides everything that follows. Sullivan's Island sits at the mouth of Charleston Harbor, a low strip of sand and scrub separated from Long Island, modern Isle of Palms, by a shallow tidal channel called Breach Inlet. British strategy hinged on splitting their attack in two. Sir Peter Parker's warships would sail in and pound the fort into rubble from the water, while General Clinton landed roughly 2,500 troops on Long Island, marched them down to Breach Inlet, and waded across at low tide to storm the fort's unfinished rear wall from behind. It was a sound plan. It had one flaw, and the flaw was information. British charts and local loyalist intelligence told Clinton the inlet was fordable, waist-deep at worst. It wasn't. When Clinton's advance parties actually tested the crossing, they found water 7 deep in places with a vicious current, and a South Carolina colonel named William Thompson dug in on the opposite bank with roughly 700 riflemen and Catawba scouts, ready to shred anything that tried to cross in the open. Clinton tried anyway on the 28th and again over following days. Each time, Thompson's men drove them back before they got anywhere near a real assault. The entire land pincer of the British plan, the half meant to hit the fort from its weakest, unfinished side, simply never happened. Clinton's 2,500 men spent the whole battle stranded on a sandbar, watching the naval bombardment from a mile away, unable to do a single thing about it. At around 10:30 that morning, Parker's squadron moved into position, the 50-gun Bristol as his flagship, the Experiment alongside her, and the frigates Active, Solbay, Siren, Sphinx, and the bomb vessel Thunder in support. 2 more frigates, the Acteon and the Sphinx's sister ships, were meant to swing wide and take the fort from an unguarded angle to the northwest, catching Moultrie's garrison in a crossfire. Around 11 a.m., the first broadsides opened up. For the next several hours, the fort simply absorbed it. British 9 and 18-pound shots slammed into the palmetto walls and did something no one in either army had a name for yet. The logs didn't splinter, didn't shatter, didn't send lethal wooden shrapnel tearing through the garrison the way oak or pine construction would have. They flexed. They compressed. Cannonballs sank into the spongy fiber and stuck there, half buried, while the sand packed between the double walls swallowed the shock of each impact. Now here's a detail worth pausing on because it explains a huge amount of what happens over the next few hours, and if you're the kind of person who likes catching details like this before the story pays them off, you're exactly the kind of viewer this channel is built for. Hit subscribe now so you don't miss where this goes. The 2 frigates meant to flank the fort, Acteon, Sphinx, and Siren, ran aground on a sandbar in the harbor known locally as the Middle Ground. So the entire British assault, which had been designed as a 2-pronged naval and land pincer with a 3rd naval flanking element, collapsed down to just the frontal bombardment from Bristol, Experiment, Active, and Solbay. Everything else, the land assault, the flanking frigates, had failed to materialize through terrain, bad information, and bad luck, before a single American gun crew had fired a decisive shot. Inside the fort, Moultrie rationed his return fire with an almost stubborn discipline, ordering his gunners to aim deliberately and slowly rather than burn through their limited powder supply in a panic. At one point during the bombardment, South Carolina's powder stores ran so low that a delegation had to row out from Charleston under fire to resupply the garrison, because the fort itself had almost nothing left to fire back with. At around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, disaster struck the fort's flagstaff. A British round severed the halyard, and the blue banner marking the fort, a flag Moultrie himself had helped design, toppled outside the wall into the sand, in full view of both the garrison and the British fleet. For a moment, sailors on the British ships apparently believed the fort had struck its colors and surrendered. It's the kind of detail that sounds embellished. It isn't. Multiple accounts from men in the fort confirm it, and Jasper became, almost overnight, the most famous enlisted man in the Southern theater of the war. Aboard Bristol, meanwhile, Commodore Parker was getting an entirely different education in what palmetto logs couldn't stop, because American gunners were, in fact, finding their range. Bristol took the worst of it. Raked repeatedly, her decks swept by iron, her captain killed, her mainmast shattered, springs on her anchor cable shot away so many times that she kept swinging broadside onto the fort's guns instead of presenting a narrower target. At one point a cannonball tore across her quarterdeck close enough to Parker to rip away part of his breeches, leaving the Commodore of His Majesty's fleet grazed, humiliated, and briefly, undeniably, without his pants, in front of his own crew. By late afternoon, Bristol had been hit somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 times. Experiment had taken almost as much punishment. And still the fort stood. The bombardment ground on into the evening. Hour after hour of it, nearly 10 hours total, an eternity by the standards of 18th century naval engagement, most of which lasted a fraction of that. Ammunition ran low on both sides. Smoke hung so thick over the harbor that gun crews on both sides were often firing at muzzle flashes rather than visible targets. By around 9 p.m., it was over. Fire ceased. The British withdrew what they could withdraw. Bristol crippled. Experiment badly mauled. Acteon still stuck fast on the middle ground. The next morning, British sailors set Acteon ablaze rather than let her fall into American hands, abandoning her entirely. And in one final, almost cinematic footnote to the humiliation, a party of Americans rode out to the burning wreck before the flames reached her magazine, fired her own guns back at the retreating fleet, and looted her stores before she finally exploded. British casualties: roughly 40 killed, over 70 wounded, most of them aboard Bristol and Experiment alone. American casualties inside the fort: 12 killed, 25 wounded. A fraction of what Lee had predicted. A fraction of what the British had planned for. 1 frigate destroyed. 0 American guns silenced by the bombardment. 0 ground gained by Clinton's 2,500-man landing force, which never crossed Breach Inlet at all. Britain's grand southern strategy, the plan to knock the Carolinas out of the war in one stroke, had just been stopped by a fort that wasn't finished, defended by men who weren't professional soldiers, against a Royal Navy squadron with more firepower than the entire city of Charleston could have matched in open battle. Parker's shattered fleet limped north to join the main British buildup around New York, abandoning the southern campaign entirely for the next 3 years. Charleston, and with it the Carolinas and Georgia, stayed effectively out of British hands until 1780. News of the victory at Sullivan's Island reached the Continental Congress in Philadelphia within days of a different, much larger vote. The vote to declare independence, formalized on July 4, 1776. A humiliating British defeat, landing almost exactly when Congress was deciding whether the colonies could actually stand against the world's foremost military power, gave the new declaration something it desperately needed. Proof, however small, that it wasn't hopeless. William Moultrie was promoted for the victory, captured later in the war during the Siege of Charleston in 1780, eventually exchanged, and went on after independence to serve 2 terms as governor of South Carolina. The fort itself was renamed in his honor. Fort Moultrie stands on Sullivan's Island to this day, rebuilt and modified across nearly 2 centuries of American coastal defense, all the way through the Second World War. William Jasper became a folk hero almost overnight. Offered a battlefield commission he reportedly turned down because he couldn't read or write and doubted his fitness for officer's rank. He kept serving as a sergeant, kept fighting, and was mortally wounded 3 years later at the Siege of Savannah in 1779, trying to plant colors on an enemy redoubt. The same act of defiant symbolism that made him famous, repeated once more, fatally, at the very end of his life. Charles Lee, the general who wanted the fort abandoned, got the credit anyway in the eyes of a Congress that didn't fully understand what had actually happened on the ground. Promoted to command in the North, where his career unraveled in spectacular fashion 2 years later at the Battle of Monmouth, ending in court-martial and disgrace. Sir Peter Parker survived his humiliation, recovered from his injury, and continued a long naval career, eventually rising to full admiral, though the story of his lost breeches followed him for the rest of his life, retold and exaggerated in taverns on both sides of the Atlantic. Henry Clinton, stranded on that sandbar with an army that never got to fight, went on to become Britain's overall commander-in-chief in North America for most of the rest of the war, and would preside 5 years later over the final catastrophe at Yorktown, alongside another young officer who'd been present at Sullivan's Island in 1776 and would surrender an entire army in 1781. His name was Lord Cornwallis. There's a particular irony sitting at the center of all this, and it's worth saying plainly. The British Empire brought the most powerful navy on earth to erase a fort that its own defenders privately doubted, and lost. Not to superior tactics, not to superior numbers, but to a swamp tree nobody had thought to test beforehand. Fort Moultrie still stands on Sullivan's Island today, a National Park Service site, its walls long since rebuilt in brick and concrete. But the palmetto tree that saved it never left. It's on the South Carolina state flag. It's on the state seal. Every time someone in Charleston sees that image, they're looking at the reason a rotting, unfinished fort of soft wood and loose sand did something a fully manned Royal Navy squadron could not. It held.